Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasegawa, and this is episode 125. Today's guest is Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. On today's episode, I'm talking with writer Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. Rowan Hisayo Buchanan is the author of Harmless Like You and Starling Days. She has won the Authors Club First Novel Award and a Betty Trask Award and been shortlisted for the Costa Novel Award. Her work has been a New York Times Editor's Choice, an NPR Great Read, and recommended by Oprah Magazine. Her short work has appeared in several places, including Granta, Guernica, The Guardian, The Harvard Review, and NPR's Selected Shorts. She is the editor of the Go Home anthology. She has received residencies and fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, the Malay Colony, Hedgebrook, Gladstone's Library, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and Kundiman. In our conversation today, Rowan and I are discussing her latest novel, Starling Days, which was originally published in the UK in 2019 and came out in the US in April 2020. In the opening scene of Starling Days, one of the main characters, Mina, is looking out over the edge of the George Washington Bridge when she's picked up by police who she can't convince that she wasn't about to jump. She's released to her husband, Oscar, who then takes her with him on a business trip to London, partly in the hopes that a change of scene will be helpful to her, and partly out of a desire to keep watch over her. The story that follows is, I think, a beautiful and profound depiction of, well, depression and mental illness, yes, but also different kinds of love, about different forms of family, about how people come together and how they hold each other and themselves apart, sometimes both at the same time. It is at times a heavy story, and the closeness of the prose gives us a window into Mina's thoughts when she is struggling the most. And there are moments between Oscar and Mina, or between other characters, that are tense or frustrating. But there's also deep tenderness in this story. There are moments of levity, of wonder, of the thrill and promise of something new entering the characters' lives. It's just a gorgeous book, and I'm so pleased that I got the chance to talk with Rowan about it. I've included some links in the show notes to places where you can purchase a copy of Starling Days, which just recently came out in paperback. There are links for Greenlight Bookstore in New York, Pages of Hackney in London, the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and bookshop.org. And of course, as always, I highly encourage ordering from your own local independent bookstore. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. I wanted to say I really enjoyed Starling Days quite a bit. It was a really meaningful book for me to read for a lot of reasons. And one of the things that I was thinking about, just sort of as a general sort of framework for how I took in and understood the book, has to do with the idea of connection. Because I feel like the idea of connection and separation is really central to the plot and not just the main characters, but kind of like all of the characters. And, as I was reading it and rereading it, almost every interaction has in it this element of people trying to connect with each other or trying to remain separate from each other, and either succeeding or failing in one or the other of those. And it takes a lot of different forms, whether that might have to do with nationality or neurotypicality or gender or sexuality or race, ethnicity, all of these different things. But it seemed like it's such a big part of how everyone in the book interacts with each other, this idea of connection and separation. So I wanted to talk with you about, how you approached writing about this and why it was important to you or if it was important to you, I suppose, to have this element in your book.
Thank you for reading so carefully and describing it that way. It's really, I feel like you described what I was trying to do better than I can. But so, yes, I would say yes. Something that I am definitely not the first author to be fascinated by, and I think the novel lends itself particularly well to exploring, is sort of fundamental aloneness of being alive, and yet how despite knowing we're never going to get to live in anybody else's head, we still keep trying. We still keep trying to reach out in various ways, even when understanding feels as if, or actually is, maybe impossible. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I love novels generally as a reader, is you get to pretend that you're in somebody else's head. And it can feel like a particularly deep form of connection. Sorry, I'm now saying, like, this matters to me overall. You have analyzed me very well. But I think particularly in this book, it was important. And in many ways, because it's a two-handed book. So it's about Mina and it's about her husband, Oscar. And I always knew that it would be a book about their relationship as much as it is about either of them as an individual. And so in some ways, it necessarily became about that.
Yeah. This thing that you were saying just now about the novel being the kind of thing where you can access sort of other points of view, I think about that all the time. I mean, I've said this, I don't even know how many times in different conversations, both on the show and off, that I feel like the thing that's interesting about art is that it's a conversation and that it can communicate something between the artist and the audience. And this, way of, you can put marks on a page, and by doing that, you can induce some kind of a brain state in somebody else. It seems like magic to me. In particular, one of the things is, I think the focus of the book is very much on the relationship between Oscar and Mina, and in particular, but the fact that she has this depression, mental illness. This is a major focus of the book. But I sort of wanted to talk about a slightly different aspect of it, and had to do with something that I connected with on a personal level, that Oscar, the character, is biracial. He has one white English parent and one Japanese American parent. And it informs a lot of his identity, but not just his identity, but how he interacts with Mina, how he interacts with his parents, how he interacts with his friends, this sort of multiplicity of ancestry and background and culture, and sort of being inside both, but also outside both, is something that really, really resonated with me. And to me, it also speaks to this idea of connection and separation. So you've written about the experience of being multiracial before. In the pre-show, I mentioned that the first piece of yours that I had read was a catapult piece called Woman Scared of Her Own Kimono, which was, I think, very much about a similar feeling here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this aspect of Oscar's character and how you approached that, why it was important to you to include this in the book.
I think it's partially important to me to write mixed race characters or multiracial characters, because I always wanted them myself. I'm part Japanese, I'm part Chinese, and then there's like a bunch of white people, some Scottish, some Manx, some English. And, I collected them like I had a bookshelf when I was younger of just every time there was a writer who was mixed race or a book about a mixed race character, I would buy it. If I saw it, I would keep it, cart them around with me. And so now I would be letting myself down in some way if I didn't write about them. But I think in particular, Oscar is important to me because he wants to be right. He wants to be right in England, and he wants to be right for his Japanese father, and he wants to speak Japanese better. And for me, writing down the descriptions of him struggling with an app on his phone to practice Japanese and feeling like he isn't good enough. And he's not in Japan, he's in England at the time, but still wanting desperately to get it right, to be worthy of his family, was something that I had felt. And I almost felt embarrassed writing it down, because I was like, well, he's not me in all sorts of ways, but I've given this thing, and I almost felt scared to have people read it, because I am now lucky that I have a lot of friends who are from the Asian diaspora, and some of them are very, very multilingual. In fact, my brother's long-term partner speaks Chinese and Polish and German and English, and it's amazing. And I'm here going, yes, I can tell you about my relationship to my grandfather. I can grow up eating certain foods, certain like visual symbolism is so much part of how I see the world that it sometimes even surprises me when I find out, oh, that's a Japanese thing or that's a Chinese thing. And yet I don't have the language. And I wanted to give him that experience, or to write about that experience, because again, I guess I wanted maybe somebody else reading it who would connect with it to find it. I think also you mentioned that a lot of the book is about Mina's mental illness, but Oscar as a character is juggling a lot because he is the child of two people. He's not only mixed race, he's illegitimate. And he's really struggling in some ways to connect to his father and be worthy of the business, all the while sort of in his mind managing his wife. And I didn't want to write a character, a sort of a husband who is a villain, where it was like intelligent, academic, but troubled wife plus horrible husband. I wanted him to also be having his own mess to deal with, so that when they are cruel to each other, you as the reader can see into their minds and understand where it's coming from, rather than have one person be the hero and one the villain,
Yeah. I'm interested to know, I guess, because the book has been out for a little while now. It's been out, I think, for a couple of years. And so I'm interested to know, like, when you get reader reactions, how do you find that people do take the two of them, because I think for myself, when the first time reading through the book, I found his way of interacting with Mina, it felt a little bit like overbearing or smothering, perhaps, like he's so on every single thing that she does. I think in the second reading, and especially sort of knowing more about, as you go through the book and find out more about his history, his personal history, it inflects that behavior in such a way that it becomes more understandable. But I'm really curious to know, like, have you found that the audience has sort of taken to one side or another? Because there's just always so much of a way that we're sort of indoctrinated to think of these things in binaries, in like opposites, in good guy, bad guy kind of things. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I think both my first book and this book have two main characters, and I think people take sides. And the thing that I found interesting with Starling Days is I think more people see his wife Mina as the protagonist, but the people who connected with Oscar really connected with Oscar. And I found that very interesting because to me, they were both the main character. And sometimes I don't know if the people who assume she's the main character assume it because she's female and I'm a female author and therefore she must be the main character, or maybe it's simply because the book begins from her perspective. And so she's the first person you meet. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. She is the first voice that you get in the book. And because especially the first scene where she's sort of walking along the bridge has this encounter with the police, what may or may not be a suicide attempt, it's very close and it's kind of an emotionally intense scene. So I think that does sort of put you in her space immediately. But it is interesting because I think I sort of felt in the first reading that she was the protagonist, and I didn't realize that it was because of that. But I think that's definitely got a lot to do with it. But as in the second reading, because of the fact that the two characters separate, right? Like they're together at the beginning, they go to England together, and then they have to separate for a while. First, Oscar goes to his mother's, then he has to go be with his father for a while. And they sort of have these separate but parallel storylines. And I think in terms of at least word count or whatever, you get a similar amount of time with Oscar by himself that you do with Mina by herself. So yeah, that's an interesting thing. Do you find that being drawn to writing a story without a single protagonist is something that's appealing to you in general? I'm curious about what it is that form sort of brings out for you.
So I was reading something that actually, no, I wasn't reading it. I was interviewing the writer Ruth Ozeki, who some of your listeners might know is part Japanese, part Caucasian. And I think all of her books have two protagonists or two narrators. And I was asking her about this, and she was saying, well, for her, it's the most natural form, perhaps as a mixed race person. I may be paraphrasing that wrong, but that she was always seeing things from two perspectives. And so writing from two perspectives just made sense. And I think for me, there is some of that potentially. I think also in some ways for me as a writer, there are people who have one point of view about things generally in the world that may or may not have to do with their race. They're just like, they have an opinion. They're usually on Twitter telling you their opinion. It's very clear. I am someone who has a strong opinion, and then 2 seconds later, another voice in my head goes, but have you thought of this? And I think part of the writing process for me is splitting those arguments, those different points of views, those different approaches to being alive into my characters, because I don't ever agree with any of their choices, but I write them making those choices because I can see why they would make them. And then I get to have another character go, oh my, why did you do that? And to sort of play out those conflicts of world perspective, I guess, in these different people, whether or not it be mixed race characters or not, or yes. Although I'm currently working on a third book, which I think will be from one perspective, that will have two timelines. So I'm not sure if that's cheating.
I had never really considered that idea of it being a particularly mixed race thing, but that resonates with me. And I've only read one of Ruth Ozeki's books. I read A Tale for the Time Being, which was it was quite an experience. That was also a very meaningful book for me. But yeah, I wonder, I mean, I think everyone has the opportunity to experience a multiplicity of perspectives just in the idea that we have multiple people in our lives. But I wonder, I guess, if being multiracial or multi-ethnic, multicultural has a way of maybe making that more obvious to a person. That's an interesting idea. I'd never really considered that before. Yeah. I wanted to get back to something that you had mentioned a little bit before, talking about Oscar and how he is juggling a lot of things. And one of the things that I found really interesting is, the dynamic between the two of them, between Oscar and Mina, is that her mental illness is very foregrounded, both for the reader, but I think between the two of them, where, she is constantly thinking of herself as the broken one in their marriage. And it kind of seems like he kind of thinks of her that way too, or although I think he tries not to, or sort of he has an ongoing dialogue with himself about that as well. But, when I think about Oscar's character, how he is, for example, he's a list maker. He's constantly writing down lists. Like every time he arrives somewhere, he starts writing a list down. He sort of seems to be compulsive about exercise and about controlling his body, mastering his discomfort and that kind of thing. And it strikes me, considering the sort of trauma of his history, whether, that be the trauma of going through his family situation and being separated from his father, being angry about the way his relationship with his father, or, even later, the trauma of on your wedding night, finding that your spouse has tried to kill herself. It seems to me that a lot of Oscar's behaviors I can understand as coping mechanisms. And I thought it was a really interesting idea to, I guess I wonder, because I had to read it more closely the second time to sort of come away with this idea that Oscar also needs to be taken care of, and that Mina is able to provide something for him in that way that is maybe less obvious than the way that he tries to take care of her. But on the second read, it seemed like it's so clear in the text that this is something that it is a give and take between them. So I have to assume that this is something that was intentional. So I wondered if we could talk about that a little bit.
It's hard to talk about, I think, for me, this book in particular, without beginning to sound didactic. And I think one of the reasons why I did want there to be two perspectives was to avoid that, avoid saying, this is how mental illness is, or this is how you need to deal with that mental illness. So to anyone listening, please insert the thought that there are, of course, exceptions to everything I'm about to say. But one of the things that I had been thinking about actually for a long time before I read this book is the way in which, without it being someone who's struggling with a breakdown or mental illness, without being their fault, without demonizing them or treating them like, in some ways, a monster, it does put pressure on the people around them to be especially, quote, sane or put together, or, you end up putting someone in the role of the strong one, whether or not they want to, and that's a hard weight to carry. And because neither of the characters are explicitly aware of that in the beginning of the book or are thinking about it in those terms, they've both accepted their roles. I wasn't expecting necessarily a reader to see that from the get-go. But without any spoilers, I hope that the conclusion or the way the book ends might allow a reader to get that interpretation and to see the ways in which Oscar is struggling, and the ways in which maybe Mina has helped him, and the ways in which maybe she hasn't been, and where she stopped, and the fact that is actually causing him a problem, and that there are things that she experiences as being very frightening that she never thinks he might find frightening, like the fact that this point where, for various reasons, both physical health and otherwise, she thinks maybe they're not going to have children, and he is quite upset by this, but she doesn't ever ask. Anyway, she's a person I made up. I was thinking about her like she's real, but I was very interested in that dynamic and exploring, like, how do you get out of that dynamic? Can you get out of that dynamic without just pointing at the person who's having the breakdown and going, this is too much pressure on me, fix it? So that was, I guess, one of the questions of the book for me.
Yeah. I think one of the things that makes the book so compelling and also sort of simultaneously tragic and hopeful is this way that you can see so many of the characters, and not just Oscar and Mina, but I think other characters as well. You can see people trying to communicate with each other, and that there is clearly some kind of an emotional need that's being expressed. But because of, whatever reason, not least the limitations of language to communicate what we're actually going through, there is a failure of that communication. And I feel like the book kind of lives in this tension, or I'm not sure if tension is the right word, but this acknowledgement of both of those things, where there is this constant failure of communication, but also there is this continual attempt at communication. And like, depending on which side of that you focus on, it'll either be hopeful or tragic. And the book doesn't exactly resolve that. It kind of leaves both of those things as, these are things that exist, these are things that happen. But I found that, I'm not sure what a better word than compelling is, but it was that. You know what I mean? Yeah,
I do. Thank you. I think it's funny. I remember years and years and years ago, when I already had a mobile phone for several years, but I must have been in like the sort of the first couple of years of university when people had phones, but didn't necessarily have smartphones, and people were talking about, like, has the existence of the phone killed suspense? Like the mobile phone, like you can text someone, be like, the monster is coming, don't go into the asylum, or whatever it is. And I think something that has felt true for me in the world, and therefore interesting in novels, is the fact that if you are writing a novel set in the contemporary-ish era, then people can communicate all the time, constantly, they can do something that immediately tell someone that they're going to do it or it's happened. But obviously people don't. They don't always communicate or well, whether it's in person or via the phone. But what it does create, I think, is a constant feeling, but you could communicate with me. You could have communicated with me. And if I want you to communicate with me and you're not doing it, then it's not felt only as a lack, it's felt as a refusal. Whereas, if you'd written someone a letter and sent it away by horse and you didn't hear from them for a while, you'd probably assume the horses were doing something, And I sort of, in the moments when they separate, that was something that sort of a particular avenue of that communication and lack of that I was interested in. But I think, isn't that what some of the marriage therapists say? Communication. Sounds so easy, and yet.
Oh, yeah. And yet there's even a scene. I remember there's a scene where Oscar is in a business meeting and Mina has texted him like 4 or 5 times in a row, like, why aren't you texting me back? And he doesn't see those texts right away. And then when he finally does, he sort of gives a very terse, not very communicative response. But I feel like that speaks to the same exact thing that you were just talking about. It's a perfect example of how it feels like you have the access when actually, sometimes people just don't look at their phones for half an hour or so. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about the emotional tone of the book, or rather tones, I should say, because I feel like the book, it encompasses and sort of depicts a really broad range of emotional tones. We've talked about the ways that Mina and Oscar's relationship has a certain strain to it through much of the book. Oscar also has his relationship with his father and stepmother is strained, especially in the early portions. There's also a scene where Oscar is interacting with his mother, that there is, I think, a certain subtext there that also, it's sort of on the surface sort of pleasant, but I think that there's a sort of subtext of tension in that scene as well. On the other hand, where Mina, there are scenes of Mina's that are fairly dark or heavy, but also, she spends a good portion of the middle of the book meeting and sort of being infatuated with this other character, Phoebe, who is Oscar's friend's sister. And those scenes where she is, essentially kind of going out on dates with Phoebe. It's not really presented in that way. I don't think that Mina is initially thinking of it that way, but that's sort of how those scenes feel, is as though they are going out on dates. And those scenes, they feel like something that could very easily be straight out of a romantic comedy. They're very light. They're very, there's always sort of elements of anxiety to them as well. But even a lot of the anxiety that's presented is sort of almost like adorable, does she actually like me kind of anxiety? And having all of these different feelings from scene to scene, I could imagine like an editor saying like, this doesn't feel like it's in the same book as this part, but I never actually felt that way. I felt like it all feels of a piece. And so I guess the question for me is like, well, there's 2 questions. One is like, what was it about like the story that made you want to include such a wide range of emotional tones, but also just like, how'd you manage to get it all to fit together so well?
Well, that's really, really nice of you to say. So I think for me, there are some manifestations of depression that are crawling into a bed and just not getting out of it. And that is perfectly valid. But I also know, every time you see a famous person or even a not famous person who has committed suicide and people go, oh, but they were only out at a party last week, or they seemed like they were in a great mood. And, to some extent we say, okay, yes, they are masking it. But I think there's also a way in which mental illness is supposed to neurodivergence. So where the person experiences it as an illness. I think people talk about battling with mental illness, and I think that's because it's a battle. If you are still trying to survive, you are still trying to find joy, there are going to be moments where you do, even if you are then later overwhelmed. And so for me, the scenes with Phoebe made sense because Mina, after having been picked up by the police and after Oscar sort of brings her on this work trip to London, her job is to be happy. She's taken a break from work, and the idea is that she's going to fix herself and become happy, which is a bit of a tall order. And she tries. And so when she finds some person that makes her happy, she tries to plunge into it, to embrace it and commit to it. And I think what I hoped that the reader would see in the reading of it is both that there is real joy there, and there is real pleasure in this other woman's company and interest and admiration in exploring the city with her. But there's also this danger that she's investing so much in it when she's married to someone else who she does love, and also that it's putting a lot of pressure on this woman that she's just met. And so that the reader hopefully can see it not as being sort of separate from the breakdown, but in a strange way, despite the joy being real, that it's part of the fallout from the moment that the book begins with on the bridge.
That makes a lot of sense. I think, and it reminds me too of like how even in the sort of darkest moments of the book, like when she's really in the middle of it, there will be little things that she'll notice, like the bathroom looks this way. Well, when she's, right in the middle of an extremely intense scene. I mean, I guess I don't know how much I want to give away, but like I'm thinking of a scene towards the end, like right towards the end of the book. That's a very intense scene. There's a lot of gravity to that scene, but then she'll also just be noticing something like, I mean, I don't remember the exact details, but it would be like, there's like the grout over there needs to be scrubbed or something like that. How there is this sort of, even in when one is in the grips of an extreme emotional experience, that there are still these little moments of banality to it. And that seems like a related sort of phenomenon to what you're talking about here, that mental illness or depression, or really even a single moment, it's not always one thing happening, continuously. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I had a friend who told me that a long time before we'd had the conversation, he'd been talking to his therapist about wanting to die, and his therapist had said, and I, by the way, Rowan, do not endorse this point of view, but his therapist said, if you don't smile for a month, you can kill yourself. Rowan, I'm not saying that any listener should do this, but for my friend, this worked very, very well, because he couldn't go a month without smiling once, that despite the fact he was really struggling with something very, very real, there was still those moments. And for him, it helped to notice those. Anyway, yeah. I guess I was always very struck by that story when I was told it.
That thing that you just said about, this is not what I, Rowan, am saying, this is what that person was saying. I feel like there's an aspect of that in the writing of this book as well. And I think you've talked about this in other interviews as well, but I still feel like there's an interesting conversation to be had about this, that, your depiction of Mina in her depression is very intense at times. And the kinds of, just one thing, for example, the sort of self-talk that she engages in is extremely self-critical and self-negative. And for me as a reader, that was very similar to my experience of depression. When I've been depressed, it has often manifested in extreme self-criticism. So that felt very authentic to me. But I guess I am thinking about how it can be difficult to, as a writer, everyone that I've ever talked to who is doing creative work, like I think without exception, has always said like that they're trying to just tell the story that they're telling right here, and that they're not trying to be a spokesperson for everyone or trying to represent every experience. And yet there is, I think, often a tendency among audiences to make either an author or their work into some kind of a symbol or a stereotype or a spokesperson. And that seems like a challenging thing to navigate. How did you approach this for yourself in writing this book?
I think, to be honest, I struggle with it so much more in interviews like this, even with a very kind and thoughtful interviewer like you, than I did when writing it, because I think I'm one of many writers who, especially when writing a first draft, has this sort of delusional thinking that these people are real. And so much of it is going, okay, but how would this character feel? What would they do? And hands in the air, I've never written a character ever who experienced an emotion that I haven't experienced. But did they experience them in the same order that I did, or for the reasons that I did? No, they are their own people, and that's how I feel when I'm writing it. But then when you come to talk about it, and especially as you are being encouraged to sell your book, it's not very useful to say to people, this is a book about Mina and Oscar, two individuals at the end. And so you end up being pulled into discussions about big issues and interesting issues that you want to talk about. And maybe this goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, where I said, well, there's always part of me that wants to say X, and then another part of me that wants to say, but Y. In that you find yourself saying, oh, well, this is the thing I want to say about mental illness, or this is the thing I want to say about being bisexual, or this is my experience of being multiracial, and I wanted to put in a book, but also the version of the book is different from me, and also your version may be different, and sort of, it doesn't sound very elegant when you start hedging like that.
I mean, I think it seems like, though, that this question must have been on your mind to some degree, at least before the publication of the book, just because there's this very kind, very generous author's note at the end where, essentially you are kind of saying to people, that this is this character's experience. And this is, and I think the author's note, it may be in particular having to do with not like the general idea of Mina's experience being her own experience, but I think more specifically to do with this is Mina's particular sort of position towards medication or, different kinds of treatments, and, whatever works for you personally. That's not intended to say you shouldn't do that. It's that the book is a story, not a how-to. But I mean, it does seem like, because of this author's note, which I found, I don't know, it just struck me as very kind to put that author's note in there. But it seems like this must have been on your mind to some degree before the book published.
Yes. So I think in particular terms with that, so part of the setup of the book is not just that she has a mental illness, but that she was on medication and that medication stopped working. And that's sort of what triggers this whole need to re-examine who she is, and she decides to go without medication. And I know that there's a lot of conflict around people taking medication. Sometimes they want to, and they're shamed by their families, or, etc. And I know people for whom medication has allowed them to be the person they really want to be. And I felt very responsible in that I wanted to write about this thing that does happen. Mental health medication does sometimes, for some people, stop working, without invalidating or giving people fuel to invalidate other people's lives or their choices. And I thought quite a lot before I wrote that note, because I am really of the school that would normally say you let the work of fiction stand as itself and speak for itself, and you can go on interviews and talk about it, and you can go on, whatever you like, but that fundamentally the work has to stand on its own, and it's good or it's not good on its own. And yet was that I thought I gave Mina a lot of negative self-talk, and Oscar has some quite negative talk about her too. Yeah. And I thought, I think someone in a good place could understand these things in their context. But if a person at their least healthy read this and thought these things were being said to them or about their condition, would I feel good about myself for having gone, I stood by my literary principles and didn't write a note about this? And I thought, no, I wouldn't feel good about that. And so I wrote it, and I know that I don't know how other readers take it. So, some readers may just may think, you don't get to talk about your book in your book. And I hope that for those readers that they just close it at the final page and ignore that note. But I felt that it was more important to be responsible to my most vulnerable readers, if that makes sense.
I feel like there is just not possible to completely separate the work from how it lives in the world. For me as an artist, I am always primarily driven to make the work because I have a thing that I want to express. And whether that might be, if I'm writing a poem or an essay or something and I want to express something narrative, or if I want to, as a photographer, I want to make images that are trying to express a certain emotion or something like that. The primary drive is always the desire to express myself. But then for me, the question is always, well, okay, so I have made this work and it expresses a thing. I think that it expresses a thing that I want to express. But then if I put it out into the world, it's going to do something. The act of putting it out into the world is going to do something. And, like I mentioned before, the thing about art that's compelling to me is that it is a conversation, that it's communicative. But just like in a conversation, if you've only got one person talking, then it's not a conversation, right? Like the words that you're expressing have to be, received by someone. And then in that interaction, the communication is transformed somehow. It seems to me like this in a lot of ways is perhaps, one of the main tensions of being an artist is this relationship between the desire to express and the notion that once you've expressed it, that there may be some consequence to that or result of that, You know what I mean?
I do know. This is a silly story, but my parents, who did not, as far as I know, go to literary festivals before I became an author, decided to start going to book festivals, first mine and then others, to, I think, essentially scope out my competition, which I love them for this. And my father went to a reading, I think, with Anne Patchett, and, which very famous writer. And at the end, in that bit where they say, audience questions, he put up his hand, and he is the sort of parent who clapped very loudly in the school play when they see their child, which, you both cringe and are grateful. And he, waved his hand around when some moderator pointed to him. I wasn't there, thank goodness. And he went, my daughter just published a book. Poor Anne Patchett, anyway. And she's very shy. Would you have any advice for her about doing events like this? And it was reported back to me that Anne Patchett said something along the lines of, these events are very difficult and tiring, but it would be so much worse not to be asked to do them. And I think that was very gracious of her. And I, probably summarizing her, she probably said it in her own words very more elegantly. But I do think, it feels a bit rich, even if it's alarming to have to explain your work, to complain about being asked to explain it, because it means someone took the time out of their life to read it and to interact with it and to think about it. So,
Well, why don't we take a quick little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
Mm-hmm.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
So I think we previewed this a little bit, just making sure that I wasn't going to say, let's talk about something awful. And I maybe did choose to talk about something awful, which is I had said that I wanted to talk about faith. Now, before any listeners need to panic and feel that I'm going to show, it's like the equivalent of me showing up at their doorstep, holding a holy book, going, sign up. I mean this in the absolute broadest sense. And I think it's something that I've become increasingly aware that I'm curious about, because I grew up in not only a multiracial household, but a multi-faith household in which there was sort of Christianity floating around and Shintoism floating around and Buddhism floating around. And everyone was very relaxed about these religions. My parents were. In fact, I, as a child, made up a religion in which I and my brother had to go worship and pray to the bamboo in the garden. And this was, my brother's younger than me, and he still resents this time when I made him pray to this bamboo plant. And my parents, mostly found this hilarious. So I never had a moment of feeling deeply like pressured into believing or not believing anything. And if anything, I loved my mother's descriptions of both Buddhism and Shintoism, but especially Shintoism. But I came to realize in my adult life that she taught me a very particular version of it that I choose to still sort of believe, but is probably a little, I'm not sure mainstream Shintoism would necessarily approve. And so, this was the background of things that I've been thinking about in my life. But during this terrible time in the world, for readers listening in the future, I hope it has stopped being a terrible time. But we're currently in the vaccination stage of COVID. I started finding myself thinking about and talking to people about what gave their life meaning and how they designated meaning in this world. And then obviously when I retrospectively looked back at my work, both this novel in which Mina is a classicist and she doesn't believe the Greek myths, but she loves them and she feels they allow her to be slightly more connected to the world. And in my first novel, Harmless Like You, in which the protagonist finds meaning in the world through art, that I'd probably always been struggling with thinking about how you make meaning in life. And I have no answers for you, dear podcast listeners, but I thought maybe Mike would, and it would be good to chat about.
Oh, goodness me. I do not have any answers either. If anything, I've tried to, so I'm going to turn 42 in a few months. So I would say probably, let's say 25 to 30 years of my life of mine have been very wrapped up in this question of like, how do you make meaning? What's real? What's important? And the only thing that I've been able to settle on for myself is that I'm just going to keep asking these questions for the rest of my life. And in my best moments, I feel like it is the question itself. It's the search itself that is the meaningful thing. In my less perfect moments, I think, well, that just sounds like a bunch of bullshit that's making stuff, trying to make a justification to make myself feel better. It is interesting too. I think a lot of us have a certain hesitance. Certainly not all of us, considering that people do show up on your doorstep from time to time. But I think a lot of us do have a certain hesitance to talk about these kinds of things, especially if, we're, not necessarily interested in proselytizing to other people, because it is such a personal thing. And that experience that you described of discovering that, what you learned from your mom about Shintoism, it may be just specific to her. To me, it's very reminiscent to an experience that I've had just in general of trying to understand which parts of my life are, is this because I'm Japanese, or is this because this is how like my family is, or is this just how I am personally? And that question is something that has sort of been, obsessed me from time to time in my life. And it's not necessarily something that's easy to answer, especially because even Japanese people or Japanese Americans are not monolithic. And so there is going to be some range. And I find that can be both comforting to know that there is room for individuality in any of these identities, but also kind of can feel a little alienating sometimes, like maybe there's not an easy answer or a place that I can just belong. But all of these things, to me, when I think about this question about how do we make meaning, some people seem very sure of themselves, and that is just not something that I've ever been able to experience, is this feeling of certainty, which I think my parents and close family would find strange for me to say, because I'm probably in my family one of the people that has a reputation for speaking authoritatively. But I don't know that there is this feeling of certainty. For me, it is actually more of a feeling of longing. Like, I would like to be comforted and I would like to have answers, and there just aren't any. And the reality of having to make those decisions for oneself, I can imagine that some people would find that very liberating. But for me, it often feels kind of, it's the opposite of whatever comforting would be. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. It really does. And I think, it's actually one of the reasons why my mother's very particular version of Shintoism, I think, was, of all three religions that were floating around my house, the one that I connected with the most, because there are many deities in Shintoism, and also just everything's alive. Everything has a spirit. The word for soul, the word for God, it's the same word. And I think that that somehow I could accept a religion where there wasn't one God who knew the answers, but there were just lots of energetic forces floating around who you could talk to and might hurt you or might be kind to you. And oddly, that I was completely willing to take on board as a child. And it was funny because I had that realization, when I was probably in my 20s, and I'd gone to university, and I started thinking I should read about these things my mother's told me. And I went, okay, you never really told me that there's this creation myth in which the gods of Japan do a dance around a pole and the woman speaks first, and therefore her child is deformed. And you think, wait, what? And so and that's how we learn the man should speak first. And, I thought she did not tell me that story. And, I don't speak fluent Japanese. I don't go to temple. But then now, more recently, Mary Kondo being on Netflix gave me a lot of feelings, because there's this bit, for those of you who do not watch Mary Kondo, where she says thank you to all the clothes. Thank you for their service. And that felt incredibly familiar. And I remember just being like, that's Shintoism. That's just Shinto. And then, of course, I read about her more, and I discovered other people wrote about the fact that she'd actually worked in a temple at one point, and it made sense. But I realized that my mother's take on it was sort of the opposite of hers. So when we were buying toys, or we didn't buy toys that often, but anything, if there were two of anything left, we'd have to buy them both, because the other one would be lonely, and then we'd have to find it a home. So despite the same belief that objects do have feelings and, have spirits, this in my family led to hoarding. So anyway, but I do think, I guess the reason I brought up the story is just, I think I really relate to you talking about not knowing, and that of what's your family, what's not. And then when you have those points of connection where you go, oh, this comes from that, and you don't know if it makes you feel more connected or more separated, you didn't know it before. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I find, so I'm, by the long path, I'm 5th generation Japanese American. So my first Japanese ancestors that came to the United States came in the 1880s. So in that way, we've actually been here a lot longer than even a lot of white people that I know. For example, my wife is white, and her mother came here from Canada. So that's just one generation. And then her, on the other side, her grandparents came from Europe. So her family has been in the United States quite a bit shorter than mine. And, there's a lot of things that I could say about that, but just related to this topic, I feel like there is this way in which I am, and have always thought of myself as Japanese American, or just Japanese perhaps. But what that means is such a complicated question for me, because, I don't, like you, I don't speak Japanese, similar to Oscar in the book. the pandemic has given me a lot of opportunity to get on Duolingo and try and learn a bit of Japanese. I'm sure that's something that's, a lot of people similar to me might have been doing the same thing. But there is just this way that so I don't speak Japanese. Neither of my parents speak Japanese. And 3 of my grandparents don't speak Japanese. So there is this way of not knowing what does it even mean to be Japanese? What is Japanese culture? A lot of what I know has just been, small experiences with food or words here and there or attitudes that one of my grandmas will say that's a Japanese thing. But, how does she even know? Because she's just one person. And then so when I will see other Japanese people or other Asian people in general behaving a certain way or saying a certain thing, there will be this moment of, oh, I feel very connected to you right now. But a lot of times, at least in the US, a lot of the Asian people that I know, less so for Japanese people specifically, but just in general, Asian Americans, I feel like have a closer history to their immigrant roots than I do. And so there is this sort of facility that I think that they have with that, their heritage and their ancestral culture. For other people, it doesn't seem like even calling it an ancestral culture is a thing. It's just this is my culture. Whereas for me, it feels very much like it is my culture, but it's more like my ancestors' culture, like my great grandparents or something like that. And so the fact that these other people that I know, they're the same age as me or maybe younger, maybe a little older, will have this very easy familiarity with this is what it means to be a part of my culture, can feel like I have this just to get back to that word longing, this desperate feeling of wanting to have that same familiarity and facility with, cultural facility. I don't know if I necessarily have this is where I'm going with that, but that's just what you were saying made me think of that.
Yeah. No, I think it's funny because there's a lot of dialogue around, should a person describe themselves as multiracial or mixed race or, all of that. I really see a lot of the arguments on all sides. And I think there's a lot of arguments for not using mixed race, but I use it about myself, which I feel I have the right to do, because I think sometimes I feel like I identify with that more strongly than I identify, or more clearly, I feel more confidence identifying than I do with any particular part of my ancestry. And I think weirdly, the moments I connect most to other mixed race people, or even just Asian Americans, it's usually about the trying to mash the two together. I went to a talk that Celeste Ng was giving, in which she talked about how, in her house when she was growing up, or maybe in her house now, there's that thing where it's really annoying because you can't fit everything in the cutlery drawer because the cutlery drawer isn't designed for you to have a wad of chopsticks. And this was a year ago or something, maybe 2 years ago, time's gone a bit wonky. And my mind just exploded. I was like, wait, there are a set number of gaps in that cutlery drawer? I always sort of vaguely felt like I'd assumed that it was sort of, they just made a random number of them. I don't know why. And that somehow I was just disorganized and bad at fitting all my things. And I went, that's why my teaspoons always end up on top of my big spoons and then fall off into the fork drawer, the fork section. It's because there wasn't. And I think it's those moments. It's not the moments necessarily of saying yes, this is this super quotes authentic thing that comes from my culture. It's moments where you're trying to navigate all these different spaces where my heart most goes, yes, community of confused people. Or I'm sure Celeste isn't confused, but community of people who are trying to make both things work. And so I think for me, that's why I sort of winding back to the sort of the faith idea that I feel very lucky in some ways that I didn't grow up with people who were going to tell me this is God and God is mad at you. I mean, I think, there are wonderful growing up in faith and people who have faith, but for me personally, it was very freeing to have no one tell me I had to believe a particular thing. But I think sometimes it can become one of those many things where you go, okay, I feel a bit like I have a bit of belonging or a bit of stories in these different places, but am I allowed to fully fit into it? I think Shintoism in particular, because it's such a national religion, and was used very brutally in the war, in World War II. And to what extent can I, or do I want to claim part of that? But then I also remember that Shintoism was made by an emperor who wanted to unite a country, and that actually it was made up of a bunch of like local people who were looking at things and going, I think that river has a spirit, that rock has a spirit. And it was sort of all shoved together into a more formalized national religion. And so I think part of me has to go back to telling myself, whether it's about books or about art or about rocks, that like you're allowed to find connection in what you find connection in. And that's how all these things started. But it's hard. It's hard to give yourself that permission, I think, sometimes.
Yeah, it is. As far as I know, there aren't any large religions that don't have some kind of problematic history at some point. Certainly Christianity has had its ups and downs. There are ways that it's been used to oppress and ways that it's been used to, provide solace and comfort and acts of great generosity. So, but I hear you about that. I mean, I think that, as a Japanese American, like trying to reckon with the different aspects of, Japan's history, some of which happened after my family left Japan. And that makes it even weirder to think like, well, some of these things happened, 50 or maybe 100 years after some members of my family may not have lived there anymore. What does that mean for me? Like, am I still responsible for that? I tend to think it's important to still reckon with those questions. But when it comes to understanding the world and making meaning, I guess, something that I'm thinking about, that I've thought a lot about is, so my family, on my mom's side, her mom is sort of nominally Buddhist, but doesn't really practice. My mom sort of grew up without religion. And on my dad's side, my dad's family is sort of nominally Presbyterian, but, my dad doesn't really go to church, and my grandma only goes to church on, for holidays and funerals at this point. So I didn't really grow up with a strong religious tradition in my family. And I again, like, I think I must have said this already, like that there is this way that having to figure things out on my own can feel both liberating and confusing or tragic or stressful. Like, on the one hand, I think that I've ended up in a place where my sort of moral sense is, I've found, I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my own horn too much, that I get uncomfortable with that, but I have found that a lot of people that I know haven't really spent a lot of time thinking through why they think what they think. And I do sort of wonder if, like, the fact that I didn't have any kind of formal framework for these kinds of questions meant that I had to think them through on my own. But on the other hand, like, the fact that I had to think them through on my own and that I don't have some easy referent, on the one hand, it makes me feel a burden of responsibility for having had to figure it out on my own. And what if I'm not smart enough to have done a good job in thinking things through, instead of having, somebody else, some other community that's spent 1,000 years puzzling through the same questions. But also that the fact that I don't have that referent can be kind of a lonely feeling at times. I don't know if you've ever felt similar, but that sort of tension between the freedom of it and the loneliness of it is, I think that's a big part of my life.
Yeah, no, I very much feel that. And this is a very silly and personal story, but once when I was much younger, I almost dated someone who was like ancestor wise, part German and part Japanese, like purely because like I was so excited that I'd met this person who shared the similar background than me, because I grew up in England where there really weren't a lot of people who had my particular mix of things, or anything even close. And I was like so excited, and I was like, this is amazing. And all the parts of me that have been lonely and who wanted like to talk to someone about this, was so excited. And then I realized that other than this, I and this person had nothing in common at all. And so that was avoided. But, you know, you were talking earlier about writing and art making and about how much of it is about wanting to be heard or seen. And I think coming from someone who wasn't you, you know, that could almost sound, I don't know, like as an artist and writer myself, like I worry that it sounds like self-important when I, you know, if I describe that feeling of like, oh, I want to be heard for the sake of it. But I don't think it's that. I think it's the feeling of wanting to say something and hoping that you'll find recognition, that someone will come back to you and say, me too, but in a different way. Or not that you need a reader who's identical to you, but just that having someone who maybe on the surface would look completely different than you or seem completely different than you say, yeah, I felt that too. Yeah, I've had that feeling. I've had that struggle. I don't know, that it's magical. And I do wonder if some of the like longing for that, especially when I started writing, came from for a while, not having anyone in my life who ever said, yeah, me too. Do you know what I mean?
I do. You know, I've said this before that for me, I think art has provided a lot of opportunity in a more profound way than any other experience that I can think of, to feel a connection to other people. That there have been times when I read a book or saw a painting or a photograph or a sculpture or something, a play, a movie, that really profoundly made me feel like I'm not alone. You mentioned Celeste Ng, like Celeste's first book, Everything I Never Told You, was that for me. That was the first book that I'd ever read where I felt like there were aspects of my experience as an Asian American that were represented in fiction ever. Like I just never experienced that. And reading that book was a very profound experience for me. So, you know, I don't know that necessarily the work that I make is speaking to themes that are as big, or at least big to me, as something like racial representation. But I do know that there have been moments when, you know, like I've had a photograph in a group show or something, and somebody at the opening came over to me and said, oh, you know, when I look at this, it makes me feel this thing. And it was exactly the thing that I was hoping that they would feel. Just makes me feel like it's such a satisfying experience. And I think that, you know, when you want to talk about feeling grandiose or feeling self-important, to me, it's less this idea of, you know, just speaking because people will find what I say interesting that feels grandiose, but rather when I say what I'm about to say, which is that art has been so meaningful to me and helped me feel connected and less isolated when I have seen other people's work. And so I have a hope that by making my own work, that I might be able to provide that for somebody else. To me, on the one hand, that feels like an act of service, but on the other hand, presuming that I might be able to do something for somebody else that's that profound feels like deeply grandiose. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. And I think like the notes I've had from readers that absolutely most moved me were the readers who said, I read this and I felt seen in some way. And I'm infinitely grateful for that. And at the same time, not always, but sometimes, depending on the exact content of the message, I think, but damn it, why haven't you had something else earlier from someone else? You should have been able to be seen in this way before. And I suspect that even if everybody who isn't represented widely in the world of publishing were represented, we need to be seen over and over again in different ways. And I can read something written in the 1970s by a white guy and still, read a sentence about a metaphor or the catch of light and go, yes, you've given me the words for this thing I didn't have the words for before. And I think writers from all backgrounds will keep doing that forever, I hope, giving words to those sentiments. But equally, when I get a message that says, oh, yes, I'm so happy to read a mixed race writer, the first mixed race writer I read, or like, I'm so happy to read about bisexual representation or this representation of mental illness. It also makes me angry, not at them, but like that they shouldn't. I just think, it's 2020 or 2019 or whatever, or 2021, whenever I got this message. And I think, really, this should have been available to you already. Why isn't it? Why wasn't it? Because although, a lot of books are being published more widely and people are also able to self-publish and publish on the internet, I think, so much of the money and marketing force, etc., still goes to a particular, it's not going everywhere it needs to go.
Yeah.
And if the money and marketing guys are listening, I would like some of that money, but I don't just mean it should have gone to me. I mean, it should have gone to, lots of creators of color, LGBTQ, trans creators. It just really needs a little bit more spreading around.
Yeah, that is sort of the thing that I feel like there is a lot of discourse about this. That it can feel like, to people who are used to seeing themselves in represented in arts and media, that what we're experiencing now can feel like overwhelming. But we actually, is there even going to be room for people like me anymore? But when you look at the actual numbers of who's getting published and what television shows are being made and movies and stuff like that, it's actually still a fairly small percentage that goes to marginalized creators and actors or whatever. Even just that phrase marginalized, I mean, it's one that I've been using more and more over the past 5 years or so, but it's one that seems, I don't know, it just bugs me, because it's like, well, it doesn't seem like something that should be what we are centering about this community or anything. I don't know. This is a bit of a tangent. But...
No, I struggle so much with these words too. I live in England and there's a lot of controversy around BAME, which is it's the equivalent of like saying people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people who don't like it, who believe it's not specific enough. So it means, people can feel like, well, I put one of those on my board or one of those on my judging panel, one of those on my price list. Now I'm done, and it doesn't really like allow the focus for addressing particular challenges. And I really want to listen to people who feel like that, who are from groups or communities that fall under that umbrella. And I think that's the objections are largely, they make sense and are wise and everything else. But also I think as someone who is not the person suffering the most by any means, but is someone who doesn't have a huge group, I also know how the way in which the bigger umbrella terms, whether it be marginalized or people of color, give room in a way in which I feel much more comfortable, for example, saying I'm mixed race or even that I'm Asian American than I do saying I'm Chinese or Japanese, even though that is, those are my grandparents. I love them very much. But I feel like, if you've just met me and I tell you I'm Chinese, that I'm not telling you, I'm telling you something confusing.
Mm.
And I have not figured out how to navigate addressing people's specific concerns, specific challenges without also erasing people who don't have the numbers, as it were,
mm-hmm.
To be counted. Because I remember I studied economics in university And I remember that I took this class on the economics of race that was all about, using statistics, etc., to analyze like if there'd been discrimination and what way there'd been discrimination. It was actually very interesting as a lens, but a lot of the time there wouldn't be statistics for Asian people in America. So they would say that this is what's true of white people, this is what's true of Black people, this is what's true of Hispanic people. And obviously those things are really important, those analyses are really important. And then they'd be like, and the Asians weren't statistically significant. And I think week after week being told that even the group that I think of as the big umbrella group that I might be part of aren't statistically significant made me feel a little down at the heart. And trying to find a way to have banners to meet under without eradicating individuality. I don't know how to do it. Basically what I'm saying is I don't know.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know how to do it either. What I'm thinking about right now is the ways that, this actually bears on the book, I think, that, and other things that you've written, thinking about the terms that we use and how those things can be both limiting or sort of enabling, that they can facilitate something good. And in the book, I feel like there is a way of, talking about mental illness in terms of diagnoses, that there is this question of like, what is the diagnosis? Some people find the label to be, they'll talk about a diagnosis in terms of don't label me, don't put me in a box. And other people will talk about a diagnosis in terms of like, this is actually a very useful tool for me to understand things and understand how it gives me something that I can use. And I feel like it's the similar thing when it comes to race or sexuality or really any kind of identity as well, that the word, the term, it does provide you with tools to be able to understand and talk about things, but it also can feel restrictive in some ways as well. I mean, I don't know. How does that strike you?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I think it's actually funny that you mentioned the book, because so in some ways, I mean, I don't know where a book comes from. A book comes from so many places and so many thoughts that eventually you can't help but write it, I guess. But one of the places that Starling Days came from is the fact that, so my first book, Harmless Like You, is about a woman who abandons her son, and it's sort of about how and why that happens. And I found myself saying in interviews about that book, because she's Japanese, but she's been living in New York, and she experiences all sorts of things that she doesn't have the language for, not because she's stupid, but because no one's throwing around the word microaggressions. She doesn't know, she doesn't have the language for the ways in which people are treating her being excluding or hurtful. And I found myself saying in various interviews, yes, she didn't have the language to talk about it, and so ends up doing these other things instead. And I started to hear myself and think, this isn't fully true, is it? Because I think there's so much language now for any problem, any issue you might be having. There is language and a label and a discourse as to why it's occurring. And sometimes it doesn't help. Sometimes you have too many answers for why something's happening. But for example, to be specific, although this is a bit of a gloomy specific, if you don't know why you're not fitting in with the group and you are, me, let's be specific, me, I'm mixed race and I'm bisexual and I have a learning disability. And if an interaction isn't going well, or someone seems like I'm trying really hard to connect to someone and be kind and be thoughtful and engage with them, and they're just sending off I don't want to deal with you signals, I sit there going, is it one of those three things, or am I just not that charming? and you can come up with all of these explanations, but sometimes you have too many answers, and that is almost as bad as having none. Yeah, anyway, so That's something that I think about a lot in terms of sort of how we navigate what we call ourselves in any aspect of our lives.
Yeah. It's such a complicated question, and one that, as we said when we were starting this segment, I don't know that there are really answers to be had, but I do feel like, having the conversation about it and asking the questions, and even if you have to ask them over and over for the whole course of your life, that there is meaning in that, and that I think that at the very least, there's something admirable in being willing to continue asking the questions, or at least I hope that there's something admirable about it, since I do keep asking the questions myself.
Agreed.
Yeah. So we're getting a little bit close to time here, but so I wanted to just give you my last question, which is what I like to ask everybody at the end of these conversations, and that is whether there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've found meaningful that you've experienced recently.
So there's a writer called Violet Cooper Smith, who I do know personally. I met her when she was in England. She is we're talking about a lot about having mixed race. She's a part Vietnamese, part Caucasian American person, author, writer, and she had written a short story collection, and they sent me her book, Build Your House Around My Body. And I would have loved it if I didn't know her so much. It's this book it's sort of a ghost story, and it, for a while, looks like it might be a love story. And it's about a young woman who goes missing in Vietnam. And for most of the book, you don't know exactly why that's happened, but you have phantoms and mystics and hauntings, and that they're really fun, but it also tackles really big topics like abuse and sexual abuse with a thoughtful eye, in a way that feels truthful to me, because it tackles them, and also these characters are more than the things that have happened to them, or more than those singular things in any case. And it allows them to be big and multifaceted, and the women in it are sometimes hurt, but they're also dangerous themselves. And anyway, I do not believe it is available for purchase yet, but I keep wanting to talk to people about it. I think it's coming out this July. Anyway, it's very, very good. And I think people should read it. And it was one of those books that you read, and I haven't had this experience for years, maybe even since I was a teenager, where you read a book and there are multiple characters and you think, oh, I'm so much of in this case, Winnie, rather than this other character, and who I wish I was more like. And you find yourself, even though the characters are incredibly individual, really identifying with them. And I teach, and I'm always telling my students that's not how we read. We read for craft and for the overall art and the vision of the world. You don't read just because you really identify with a character or not. That's not the only way to read. But also I'd forgotten what a joy it is to really identify with the character and be like, wow, this is an amazing experience. Anyway, so what I'm saying is it's very good.
Okay. Well, I'm interested in this book. I'll be on the lookout for it. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you spent with me. I'm really glad to have gotten to talk to you. I really enjoyed our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much for asking me to be on the podcast. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. All right. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes you can use to purchase a copy of Starling Days, now available in paperback. I also highly recommend supporting the local independent bookstores in your own community by ordering a copy there. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you're enjoying these conversations and you'd like to help support the show, the best thing you can do is share an episode with someone who would like it. If you do that on Twitter or Instagram, tag the show at ChannelOpenPod, and not only will you be helping spread the word, you'll also make my day. You can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechannelopen.com. Next time, I'll be talking with writer Yang Huang about her novel My Good Son. That will be coming on May 5th, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.